coming up on this episode of the Roundtable. I guess I feel like we've been funneling part of the horror of this USAID stuff is like we've been funneling money as you guys are saying in service of the kind of GAE, the global American empire, whose flag is the trans chevroned gay pride flag, and which is, which attaches like actual kind of life-saving money to all sorts of psychotic leftist cultural imperatives. And now we have to kind of withdraw the cultural imperatives while also figuring out like what to do with the money that we do want to send to our allies. All I'm saying is it must be very confusing right now to be a chicken farmer in darkest Africa, constantly receiving about-face directives from the cultural mission on high. That must be bizarre. Hello and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at the American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books and Herculaneum Scroll editor of the American Mind. I am joined this week by Seth Barron, managing editor Mike Sabo, and publisher and president Ryan Williams. Well, we're going to pick up almost right where we left off last time. We just touched on what then was a developing story and is now still a developing story, which is the pause, halt, reversal, overturning, recalibration. Who's quite to say the something that has been done to USAID. When we last met, this was just an order issuing a 90-day hold on basically all foreign assistance pending review. I say just because it's now become about 5 other different things in the process. But this is what Chris Murphy, the senator from Connecticut, was getting all upset about, the idea that the Trump administration wanted to put a pause on foreign aid in order to review and figure out which projects did or did not align with its priorities. It later seems to have turned out to be the case that the Office of Management and Budget issued a memo to this effect without really clearing it with upper echelon staff, so that there was some confusion about exactly which programs were being paused and halted. Senators and congresspeople were fielding concerns about whether the Head Start classes were involved, HIV funding, Medicaid. There were a lot of kind of question marks. There were, of course, challenges, as we sort of predicted, from nonprofits. There was one federal judge who put the memo on hold. The memo was then rescinded, but Caroline Leavitt, the press secretary, tweeted that the memo may be rescinded, but the order itself or the project is not. They're not backing down on this. So that's kind of where things stand, at least last I checked, in the courts. The second federal judge claims that this is a distinction without a difference, and they're kind of going back and forth about that. But this Monday, staffers and contractors who work with the U.S. Agency for International Development, that's USAID, discovered that at the advising of Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency, or Doge, USAID has effectively been shut down. One staffer who wished to remain anonymous told Fox News Digital that 80% of staff across its bureaus learned they lost access to the agency's systems on Monday morning, including travel, communications, classified information, and databases. So this is a Doge initiative. It seems to be the Trump administration kind of zeroing in on what exactly it wants to review and revise in order to align with its priorities. Naturally, this has occasioned all sorts of discussion about what we are sending money to overseas. It's not the first time conservatives have expressed discontent about the sorts of things we tend to fund. I think last time we may have mentioned exploding condoms in Gaza. We don't send them over there as explosives, just to be clear. They're not exploding condoms when we send them, but they are used, it seems, as explosive devices by Hamas and its operatives. Eric Erickson put out a long tweet sort of attempting to sift through false and true claims about this. Contrary to some Trump supporters' claims, he says USAID did not spend $50 million on condoms for Gaza. It was 45 million and included other sexual and other reproductive health care, along with 10 million specifically for condoms in the Gaza province of Mozambique in Africa. So this should give you a flavor of the sort of dispute that's going on. People trying to muddle through a variety of different funding concerns, some claims that seem wrong or misunderstood, but then the clarifications also seem kind of concerning. And it definitely seems like there's a lot of money going to stuff that the Trump administration and conservatives generally would find ridiculous. I've seen claims that $7.9 million go to teach Sri Lankan journalists how to avoid binary gendered language, $4.5 million to combat disinformation in Kazakhstan, $6 million to transform digital spaces to reflect democratic principles, feminist democratic principles, $16.8 million for a separate inclusion group in Vietnam. The list goes on. I cite these not to say that I am some expert with definite information that all of these are exactly correct, but only to identify the kind of thing that I think the Trump administration is after. And the question, I guess, before us, or one of the questions before us, is whether this mode of going after it, kind of starting with a broad pause and then zeroing in the course of many various initiatives, trying to figure out what it's looking for, whether this is a good move and part of Trump's general strategy of just flooding the zone with all different kinds of initiatives and seeing what sticks, or whether this is, to coin a phrase, chaotic and does more harm than good by making the Trump White House look like it's in disarray. What do you guys think?
I kind of think this is like a very good place to start. Everybody knows, or many people have talked about the role of NGOs, and I think in the last 4 or 5 years, it's really come to the fore. The role of NGOs in promoting whatever this managerial ideology is, that this woke ideology, but also in terms of funding and fostering a permanent political class, basically like sinecures for progressives. They all work in this industry, and then they can hone their skills and their craft and go and work in political campaigns, in other NGOs, whatever it is. So it's a pretty noxious environment. And the fact that so much of it is evidently government supported is like a major issue. Like here in New York City, where I live, I've been paying attention and writing about how all of these groups, that many of which do get government funding and many don't, but they all participate in politics, which if you're a 501c3, you're not allowed to do. But obviously this is not, nobody pays attention to this. So I'm glad to see it. I think that starting with USAID, which apparently, funds all manner of woke or politically oriented institutions. And like I saw Marco Rubio say,
tries to float free of kind of political priorities and therefore basically becomes the sort of thing you're describing as
and like Rubio was saying, look, USAID operates, they don't think they're part of the US government. They see themselves as some version of like the UN, like independent. And so they need to be brought to heel. So, it seems fine. As far as all like the weird baskets of money going around, sure. I mean, that's all like, those are very amusing and kind of like strange wastes of money. And I think it all deserves to be audited, definitely.
Yeah, Joni Ernst, a Republican senator from Iowa, sort of wrote a letter outlining the ways that the general thing that you're describing, Seth, the sentiment of detachment from the government and therefore from taxpayers. So USAID's spending shows a blatant disregard for the wishes of American taxpayers, and it is time to disrupt the system. So yeah, that seems like, again, the general vibe. And I agree. I mean, you want to, it would be great if you could just laser in like one of those advanced cancer treatments and just cut out exactly the problem. But the whole issue with addressing the administrative state for all of these now several generations of Republican politics has been that it's this sprawling, half shadowed, half visible substructure. It's not even a structure because it's not coordinated. It's a bunch of different people operating within a bunch of different agencies created over time, always with some sort of pretextual justification, but then left to be forgotten and metastasize in secret. And that's obviously unwieldy, unworkable, and also anti-American. It doesn't respond to kind of basic principles of representative government. That taxpayer money should go where the the people's government dictates that for it to go. My question is like, is this basically our Belt and Road initiative now? Like, are we just, if we're going to rein this stuff in and turn it into like our a sort of form of American power projection, is it then just going to become like a tool of the American empire and all the name?
Yeah, certainly. We should distinguish, of course. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff that USAID does that's not the left just funding itself, but it looks like, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's definitely the supermajority of the funding. And it's useful to recall the history of USAID. It was created by an executive order in the Kennedy administration. And then I suspect this will come up in court pretty soon because Trump wants to abolish it or move it fully within the State Department. I read that I guess in 1998 or so, it was legislatively ensconced as a quasi-independent thing in the executive branch. So to move it, you would need Congress's approval, according to the convoluted separation of powers breaching ways in which we do modern government. So that will be one thing to watch. But it's also part of the evolution of the uses of foreign aid and foreign influence operations and general soft power diplomacy, which often just means throwing money at things to oppose other things you don't like abroad. Now, during the Cold War, a lot of that was putatively used to oppose the Soviet Union and its influence and the spread of global communism. But then the Soviet Union collapsed, the Berlin Wall came down, and we had the end of history. So a lot of this has been repurposed. A lot of it was not immediately repurposed, I don't think, although, like you, Spencer, I'm not an expert on the history. I just know the sketches. But this should be understood as the problem that we faced, which was hard to identify, but somehow not that unpredictable, which was that the all this infrastructure of the Cold War didn't just go away. It was repurposed. And especially starting in the Obama years, in league with like the McCain faction of the internationalist Republican establishment. They thought promoting American values abroad good. We need to keep doing it. It's part of what secures our liberal international order. You know, you guys all know all the buzzwords. But I think probably without full knowledge of a lot of even the establishment Republicans, but maybe some of them, it was taken up by the left. And now what it exports more than not, I suspect, and we're seeing a lot of evidence for it, is basically a transatlantic cultural, sociological, progressive, race communist project.
Right.
So, you know, one that you missed, Spencer, was I think that, you know, some millions going to fund the promotion of atheism in Nepal. Maybe that was just some internet troll, but I wouldn't put it past this establishment. So, and Musk tweeted, we wanted to see, we sort of were poking around to see which organization or institution in the federal government seemed to be in most violation of the change policy of this administration and the executive order. And USAID was like the glaring, obvious, ripe fruit to be plucked. And so they started there. And I would encourage everyone who's interested in this. There's lots of kind of half baked speculation running around, especially social media, especially X. But if you want to, the place to go is to just go to the internet autists who are parsing this giant data dump that has been affected by Doge. One in particular is a great aggregator of this stuff and then processor of the information with some allies. We've mentioned her before on the podcast. That is Data Republican. A great follow, was a lot of fun during the election. Now they are sinking their teeth into this just mountain of information and outflows of money. And it turns out, at least provisionally, it looks like, a little bit to my surprise, that organizations like Bill Kristol's parent C3, which funds the Bulwark and a lot of his initiatives, has been the recipient of USAID money, not directly, but through this archipelago of NGOs. And so it turns out it's funding not only anti-Americanism as we would understand it abroad, but anti-Americanism at home. So it's another piece of the story of the repurposing of Cold War architecture in the post-Cold War era to basically bring the Cold War home and make it a fight between different political factions at home, reflected with also a lot of work abroad. So that's how we should understand it. And for that reason, shine a bunch of sunlight on it and see what the American people think of it. I think they'll be a little concerned to learn that their tax dollars are going to fund sex change operations in Bolivia.
And I think with, Republicans, I mean, how should they kind of go about, talking about this? John Daniel Davidson at the Federalist, Claremont fellow, is writing about basically like drop the same old talking points. This is about reducing deficits, which obviously the deficits need to be reduced, but it's about shutting down left-wing propaganda. Like Ryan was talking about, this whole post-Cold War archipelago now has been used by the left to trumpet what they're doing abroad, and then also obviously just doing wave after wave of propaganda to people at home. So this needs to be shut down. It's really important that it is. Some of the funds that he found in his report, $70,000, and again, not much, for a DEI musical in Ireland, $47,000 for a transgender opera in Colombia, $32,000 for a transgender comic book in Peru, LGBT jobs in Serbia, and I mean, it keeps going on and on and on. Jonathan Keeperman found culturally specific counseling services for African American victims in the form of healing and sister circles, quilting, storytelling, theater, song, and African dance.
I think that transgender opera in Bolivia, didn't we talk about that last week? It's getting nominated for an Oscar or something. Or is that something different? I'm sorry, I got confused.
Right.
It's Amelia
That's
Perez.
a movie, Spencer, not an opera.
I mean, okay, so wait. Personally, I am still thinking about all the poor transgender activists in wherever, like Bogota or whatever, who are just woefully behind the ball. I'm listening to this book right now about the South Korean Me Too movement. It's called Flowers of Fire. It's absolutely wild document because it's written from a completely triumphalist perspective. But I'm thinking as I read this book, like, this is the book that is finally going to radicalize me about American imperialism, because this is truly an artifact of the late American empire, of, by, and for the American empire. Like, we created this sort of sexual psychosis. We went through some sort of cultural revolution in hashtag Me Too. And then via the multiple kind of economic channels whereby we distribute our culture around the world, it ultimately reached South Korea. This has a point and is related to USAID, I promise. Ultimately reached South Korea, where, like many kind of Far Eastern nations, they've been violently, radically westernized at a rapid pace economically, but not so much culturally. So there's still just a very old world kind of male-female hierarchy. And so they went through a true convulsion in South Korea, modeled expressly after American Me Too, which they're now projecting back home, hoping for kind of applause and approval via books like this one that I'm reading. Like, look, we did the thing that our imperial masters told us to do, and we're all totally soured on it. Like, we've totally moved past it. None of that matters anymore. So I guess I feel like we've been funneling part of the horror of this USAID stuff is, like, we've been funneling money, as you guys are saying, in service of the kind of GAE, the global American empire, whose flag is the trans chevroned gay pride flag, and which is, which attaches like actual kind of life-saving money to all sorts of psychotic leftist cultural imperatives. And now we have to kind of withdraw the cultural imperatives while also figuring out like what to do with the money that we do want to send to our allies. All I'm saying is it must be very confusing right now to be a chicken farmer in darkest Africa, constantly receiving about face directives from the cultural mission on high. That must be bizarre.
It's funny what you say about these outposts of empire trying to imitate their masters. Australia always seems like a funny example. Australia and New Zealand are always like about 10 years behind in terms of like woke stuff. So, I guess now they're doing their own versions of land acknowledgements and all of that. But they sometimes they take it too far. Sometimes they don't do it in the right way. It's always a little amusing and kind of sad. And now, right, like, well, we're sort of past that.
Right.
This zombie version of it like remains alive.
It's like functionally equivalent to really bad English translations of American products and content, where you're like, oh, that's kind of what Marvel movies are about, but not quite. Like that's how some of these cultural revolution aftershocks read to me as well. Like, yeah, we're gonna burn down churches in Canada because something mass graves. And it's like, whoa, guys, like we weren't actually all that serious about that stuff. Like, cool it. It's like the cool girl suddenly deciding that last year's fashion is the worst thing, even though she wore it last year. Anyway, it's a good thing. It's just like more indication of how wildly irresponsible wokeness was as a sort of orgiastic display of made up invented virtue, not just because of all the havoc it wreaked in America, but because of the way it wildly confused entire nations that sort of depend for their livelihood and safety on following our example to some degree. So I guess this
I
is
should
yeah.
one honorable mention though, Spencer. I said that I think I had cautious language about a lot of USAID during the Cold War going towards anti-communist stuff, but we should. It's sort of a half-told story still, but we should channel our old friend and dearly departed senior fellow Angelo Codavilla, who maintained that all pretty much from its beginning, the CIA has always been a left-wing organization. So now USAID is not CIA, but they were sort of in the same universe of cultural opposition to, at least putatively, to the Soviet Union. But USAID, it wasn't a huge step, I think, for it to go totally crazy, because a lot of the foreign covert and influence operations, et cetera, especially after the 60s, there's this romantic idea on the left that the CIA was terrible in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s, because it was, all it was doing was overthrowing Allende in Chile and backing right-wing dictatorships, when in actuality, what it was often doing was picking left-wing movements that it thought would maybe be kind of a counterweight to Soviet full communist organizations, and in the meantime, basically overturning quite a few stable and pro-ish American regimes in favor of pretty nasty stuff that followed, especially in Africa.
U.S. embassies have always, it's always been like an open secret that the cultural attaches are like the CIA people, right? Like that's how the spies function openly or above board in like foreign countries. Yeah, I mean, think about like the whole thing about how the CIA essentially, I don't know if they invented, but promoted and funded like abstract expressionism as an art form to rival social realism.
Yeah.
Like, okay, let's remove content from art, and that way we can provide good like massive art installations in bank lobbies or in like international style buildings, courtyards, plazas, but without any reference to anything. But then, like, in the long run, having like a referential art, you wind up like leading to this whole I guess you could argue it leads to the postmodern like vitiation of meaning from any art. Didn't necessarily have like a great effect ultimately. So it all kind of boomerangs or backfires or whatever.
Yeah, government by amorphous splotch in hotel lobby. Really not.
Kind of.
It occasionally has positive cultural feedbacks. I just bring up one because it's funny and some of our listeners may know about it. But, Julia Child, the reason she fell in love with French cooking is because, Julia was a child of like Pasadena Republicans from old school California.
What?
Yeah.
I had no
Pasadena
idea.
Republicans.
No, me neither.
And she married this guy, I think his name was Paul, who was and she was living in France because Paul was working for the State Department as an artist, producing sort of cultural outreach stuff and or helping to facilitate it. So at least we got the art of French cooking as a spillover effect from some of our cultural diplomacy.
And thank God.
Wasn't she actually CIA?
She may have
or
gotten roped
OSS?
into that too. Yeah.
Was she really? I still maintain it was all worth it. I mean, did you see what they were eating before she put butter?
Yeah.
I mean, come on. I'm Julia Child. But no, that's wild. I had no idea.
Well, one thing that's a little odd about Julia, I don't know if you watched this documentary about her, but I guess her husband was a huge photographer and he did all these nude studies of her.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I mean, it's like very odd.
Yeah.
I don't know. I haven't studied that in detail. No, can't say.
This is welcome to the roundtable where we start out talking about USAID and end up talking about Julia Child's unpublished nudes.
Oh, they're published.
It was in a biography of hers or in her, I don't know if she wrote an autobiography, but I will just say that doesn't shock me at all because she had some quite occasional, very earthy, a bit raunchy, and certainly comfortable with carnal acts phrases in describing something that's hot in the kitchen. Anyway, I'll stop. Okay, go ahead.
That's funny.
Oh my gosh. No, this is where you
Yeah, I won't tell you what to Google because it's a family show. So go ahead.
Her cooking was not the only thing that was French, if you understand my meaning. All right, this is clearly we have to shut this segment down. I'm going to move on because it's deteriorating faster than I can keep track of. But this is, I guess, the all Doge episode of the roundtable because we previously had sort of a Muskified Trump initiative. Now we have an attempted hit piece, another hit piece that blew up in the author's face, much like the one in New York Magazine. This time, I would say an even worse misfire by Victoria Elliott, writing for Wired about the men, gasp, who are young, double gasp, and don't have any government experience, triple gasp, and are now part of Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, so-called Department of Government Efficiency, writes Elliot. I really want to know what so-called means there, I guess because it's not a government department, but it's certainly a department and it's certainly related to government efficiency. And that is in fact what it is called. Anyway, I mention this only just to give you a flavor for the ineptitude of this article and its spirit, which is screw these guys, they're young bros, and what do they know about the carefully constructed edifice built up over decades to run programs like the exploding condom train in Gaza. All they are is guys like Akash Baba, Edward Coristine, Luke Ferrator, Gautier Cole Killian, Gavin Klieger, and Ethan Shoutron. They're just engineers, and all they've done is, oh, wait a minute, checks notes. Ferrator was part of an award-winning team that deciphered portions of an ancient Greek scroll, a Teal Fellow, which is to say he got a fellowship to drop out and work on his own entrepreneurial projects, former intern at SpaceX. Gee, these guys actually sound kind of impressive. And of course, the more you dig into their individual backgrounds insofar as they're known, the more it turns out these are hyper competent wunderkinds. I'm going to save my excursus on the Herculaneum scrolls that Ferrator was working on for a later moment in the segment. But truly it was an awesome discovery that he and his team were involved in. Many other things have come to light about these guys demonstrating their competence in a variety of areas. And we just thought we would like take a bit of time here to dig into the meaning of expertism discourse that's going on here. What do you guys, I mean, what is there to say besides pointing and laughing about this Victoria Elliott piece?
I mean, I see it in two ways. All right, one, the left is flailing. I mean, Trump is brilliantly unveiling new narratives every single day, thus like obviating like the planned headlines for the next day. I feel like 10 or 20 years ago, the story that Elon Musk was going through everyone's social security data and IRS forms, like that's the sort of thing that would have attained legs for a week or two, with like Democrats pulling all kinds of stunts. And it's obviously not really what's happening, but he somehow has managed to undo their campaigns by just promoting some other thing the next day. Anyway, yeah, okay, these guys are clearly brilliant guys who he has working on these things. At the same time, I don't want to get too excited about how wonderful it is to have half a dozen, or this fantasy of half a dozen like techie bros reorganizing the government, because didn't we oppose all of that sort of thing under COVID? This elevation of the scientist and the expert and techne as a substitute for like politics, statesmanship, democracy, the republic. I kind of thought like we didn't really necessarily want so-called experts to be making policy. Like they can advise, but I don't know. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's the point's well taken, Seth, but I think it's different in the sense that, I mean, at least these young kids who are high IQ and good at efficiently moving through information with the assistance of, AI or whatever, which and algorithmic processing, with which they are very comfortable and very experienced using, even though they're 22 or whatever. But I think we should be careful to distinguish the ends that they are pursuing, that is, the purposes that they're using this technical knowledge to advance. So that's the most important thing. So I think true expertise, or at least skill at administrative tasks, is, a praise for that. And the necessity of that is as old as the Republic. It was a great theme of Hamilton's. And, a government administered badly can only be called a bad government, was basically his line in the Federalist Papers and elsewhere. So it's a good opportunity for us to distinguish between that is to say, you need competent people administering a government, especially for a country as large and as complex as ours. But where we get off the boat is the substitution, which you basically said, the substitution of technical expertise for statesmanship, prudence, and for wise governance. So Trump is allegedly signing off on every major Doge initiative. So to the extent that these guys are just facilitating the efficient unearthing of all sorts of data that was hitherto obscured, I think we're fine with it. And but we should definitely lean against the notion that variously advanced in the most sophisticated form by Curtis Yarvin, that really what America needs is a high IQ CEO. I don't think the founders would have agreed with that, and we certainly don't agree with that. So we should oppose wherever we find it the notion that somehow Elon Musk knows much about anything about properly structuring the federal government, although he may have a great team that's very good
Mm-hmm.
at ferreting out insane expenditures and inefficiencies and all the rest.
Yeah, I don't want to dominate this, but I'm just saying, like, I agree that this is like, a minor thing, and it seems like what they're doing is good. I just see a tendency now with
Yeah.
Musk and with like all of the tech people and like their excitement. I just, I really would not want to see Silicon Valley take over the U.S. government. That's all I'm saying.
No, and one data point, yeah, one data point in Musk. I mean, he'll admit it, but he needs to like draw out the conclusions of it. He'll admit, Musk will, that he's like up until yesterday, he really didn't pay too much attention to government, at least where it didn't intersect with his business interests and contracts and all the rest. But like he tweeted, I think today or yesterday, this a chart of education spending over the last 70 years and educational attainment. And he's like, that's crazy. It's like this has been like ho hum talking points for the right for 40 years. So it's just an example of him coming with fresh eyes comes fresh naivete. And so we should guard against its influence being counterproductive and misguided rather than facilitating the wiser judgment of more experienced folks.
No, and I think your point's well taken too, just with the idea of it's not about knowledge, it's about the consent of the governed, it's about them, us, giving our limited parts of our powers to do what we want it to do. So I mean that's the whole point. And yeah, Seth, I think you're right still to be, we should be we should kind of have the mindset of our forebears where, we should be watchful of our liberties. We should know, even though we like what Trump is doing. I think we generally like what Musk is doing. This is not a technocracy. I mean, this should be a Republican government. We should be doing everything we can to reestablish that. So I think to be vigilant, to guard against some of that, I think that's the American spirit.
One way of approaching this question is to ask what the functional meaning of the word expertise is in this Wired piece. Like, what work is that word doing for Victoria Elliott? And is it the same thing that we want out of these tech bros or not? Because absolutely, we've been skeptical in the past. Certainly, when it comes from the left, we've been skeptical of this idea that the government is a machine and that the same skills which you might use to code a computer could be then directly applied to managing the American people. And in COVID, that was a very left wing view, but it's also present among the kind of libertarian set of Silicon Valley. So we want to be wary of that. And also it's possible to find that kind of sentiment like floating around in the air now. But I also think that's like kind of not what Musk seems to want to apply to the government. It's much closer to what Victoria Elliott seems to want and her buddies seem to want out of government officials. Like, here's Nick Bednar, professor at University of Minnesota School of Law, who's quoted in the Wired piece. This is very unlikely that is, these young guys, have the expertise to understand either the law or the administrative needs that surround these agencies. Now, when I hear that, I feel like basically all you're asking is that these guys be obsessed with the procedural minutiae of the administrative state, essentially, and for its own sake, as a theory of government unto itself. And you're saying you're beyond just like a certain kind of partisan allergic reaction. You're saying like these guys don't have that kind of operational obsession, which to my mind is like totally a good thing. What they do seem to have is like a high degree of competency. And their competency seems to be in like identifying inefficiencies, striking to the heart of a problem, finding innovative ways to solve and deal with it. And that seems like something you absolutely could apply to the government in exactly the role that like Musk is now in. What we object to, I think, is the idea that that kind of specific skill is government or like is legitimacy. Like automatically, if you have that competency, that underwrites your kind of rule over the people. So yeah, I don't know. It's like that's not something I would never associate with Musk. Like I think Musk is liable to make that mistake, but it actually doesn't seem like that's what we enjoy about these guys at this moment. It's just that they're kind of like hyper competent and can be aimed at the government to make it more efficient.
I've mentioned this to you, Spencer and Mike, offline, but I'm reading this book, Ungoverning, by these two Harvard public administration professors, Rosenblum and Muirhead. And, they're lamenting, especially in the first Trump administration, because it came out maybe 4 months ago, which means it was written about at least 10 months ago. And they specifically say that the legitimate claims of the administrative state upon a Republican form of government or good public policy or a reasonable authority and legitimate authority are it's proceduralism, it's expertise, and I mean, that's basically good enough. So I haven't finished the book yet, but there's this kind of underwear gnome quality to some of these critiques. It's like step one, install experienced experts in government with PhDs or masters in public administration, or they pass the much watered down civil servants exam or whatever. Step two, question mark. Step three, enlightened public policy. I mean, the giant black box that is step two is what Musk is going after and wanting to sort of shine a light on. And anyone who knows folks who have worked in agencies like, take one, for example, Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. I heard secondhand from one of our friends that they said, the political appointees there who've been there for the last 2 weeks say it's a very weird look to the place. It's like a bunch of, mostly a political appointee dudes in suits on the 12th floor, and then a scattered and diverse array of predominantly women wearing pajamas in the rest of the floors of HUD. So, I mean, maybe that's a bit of a caricature, but anyone who's come into contact with greater DMV, which is the euphemistic and derogatory term used for the greater federal establishment in Washington, in and around Washington. I mean, the idea that there's this vast sea of competency and expertise that keeps everything running just right is laughable. And so I welcome the 22-year-olds. I will remind everyone that Madison and Hamilton, when they played essential roles in early revolutionary America, were barely north of 21 or 22 themselves. Now, granted, this is not the fault of modern folks who may be young. Madison and Hamilton were much better educated, so we should, of course, put an asterisk on that. But still, the idea that, and then finally, and I thought we were all supposed to love the ascent of public spirited, efficient, high IQ young people going into government. I mean, this was extolled by the rise of Obama's, young staffers, and many pieces written on that. So we should take all this for what it is, which is mostly, as you say, Seth, a flailing and somewhat desperate attempt to throw a wrench in these gears of Doge.
I'm sorry I'm being so contrarian today.
No, it's okay.
But
please.
How many years have any of you spent in corporate America? I will tell you the idea that the public sector is uniquely incompetent, unqualified, and inefficient, and that the private sector is where, like corporations, is where you need to go to find like cutting edge, like super efficient, hyper productive people.
Wait. But for 2 points. First of all,
I just want to say I spent a decade in like corporate America. So like I can tell you,
questions. Like, isn't the sludge that you're describing in corporate America very often a response to government initiatives that have imposed all sorts of bizarre, like, hoop jumping requirements? One. And second of all, it's not the private sector that people are kind of looking to for cutting the red tape. It's Musk, who is known for doing this in the private sector, right? Like taking Tesla or Twitter.
Sure. Like there's the entrepreneurial spirit of America and, invention and all of that. And, this sort of brilliance of like Henry Ford or Edison or, Musk or Carnegie or whoever. And then there's like bureaucratic.
Oh, yeah. Totally agree.
Slogs, which I think you can find on either side. And yes, I agree that there are people at the Wall Street Journal who would co-sign what you just said. Oh, but it's all the fault of regulations. I don't know. Go get a job. Go get a job at a major corporation for like 6 months and tell me what you think. I mean, maybe I'm wrong.
I would just say, the managerial revolution has been an efficient nuclear reactor that produces endless bullshit jobs, private and public. I think so. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, let me just say, I was at AIG while they were like planning credit defaults, buying credit default swaps and all that garbage that led to like the meltdown of the company. like this great insurance company, whatever. I've seen plenty of like garbage going on, totally wasteful, totally like inefficient. I'm not saying that everybody in corporate America is like a disaster or lazy, but I'm just trying to be a little bit.
That pencil pushing and officious managerialism are not the exclusive
No.
province of
Mm-hmm.
government officials. Like totally granted. And as Scrooge said to his fiance, "I must bow to your conviction that you're right because you have way more like direct firsthand experience of this situation than I do." My only point would be like one of Musk's sort of resume items for taking on this role is precisely that he's very impatient with exactly that kind of obstructionism in the private sector. Like within companies, he's constantly firing people or yelling at them
Oh yeah,
for doing exactly
Yeah.
what you're describing. So I
totally,
guess people are
totally.
hoping he'll carry that into.
But at the same time, is that? I mean, I just for some reason, like, is that really the way we want society to run, where everybody has to work 15-hour days and sleep on the floor and have some
No,
like.
but do we is Musk? But this is like the accepting the left's framing that Musk has like somehow been elected shadow president of the United
No,
States.
no, no, no.
He's
Yeah,
you know he's there to cut fat, and like legitimately there are questions about whether he can actually do that.
yeah.
But nobody's appointed him like
No, no, no. I get that.
czar of the
I,
private sector.
I admire the guy. I mean, he's impressive. He's an impressive character.
Sure,
You know.
sure. But you're just saying
Yeah.
like
No, I
this
was
is
just to
not the
say,
spirit,
no,
really.
channeling Seth, I would like to,
Sorry, go ahead.
for private sector corporate America, money is spent on jobs where people basically are either in meetings or in Zoom meetings or email each other all day. I bet it's like 40%.
I mean,
Again,
most
I
of
just
corporate
like
America.
it's not because I'm a Wall Street Journal libertarian that I'm suggesting this is like a response to government interference. It's more like a sort of a Chris Caldwellian argument I'm making here that a lot of that stuff is like a downstream consequence of
Mhm.
corporations doing CYA in reaction to civil rights law. Like that, that stuff is very much tied up with the public sector as well as the private. We should take just a hot second and cover this last topic because it's worth noting that another kind of leitmotif of politics in the last couple weeks has been this sort of debate about what Christianity entails in government, in American government specifically, and what it means to be a Christian public official, which is right up our alley. It's a huge topic, but obviously it's in the news because so many of the Trump priorities are the kind of priorities that the left likes to caricature as fundamentally anti-Christian, that make you into a hypocrite if you're going to be a Christian and you're going to cut aid, or you're going to be a Christian and you're going to deport all these people. Well, then you're obviously a hypocrite. And we had one tweet from James Martin, I think a Jesuit priest whom I've actually enjoyed his book on Jesus, but he is pretty woke at this point. He says, in its simplest terms, the apparent demise of USAID is the result of the world's richest man ending a program that helps millions of poor people. You don't need a PhD in moral theology to see why this is an evil. You can just read Jesus' parables on the rich and the poor. This is something which, way back in the day, Peachy Keenan published this piece for us called So You Call Yourself a Christian. And it was sort of about this phenomenon that often the teachings of the New Testament are held up as a foil to conservative Christian politicians. And there's like a lot of bad faith argument that goes on here, but there is also kind of a new dispute going on about what public Christianity should look like in 2025 America. And this came again to the fore when JD Vance in a Fox interview was defending the administration's immigration priorities. and made reference in a kind of oblique way to this notion that Catholics call ordo amoris, the ordering of loves. Vance basically said, first you are supposed to love your immediate surrounding people, your family and your neighbors and your community, and then your country. And then once you have that all sorted out, then you can reach out and love, quote unquote, the world. This very much is Catholic teaching. It's also, I think, pretty basic, like general philosophical attitude shared by a lot of faiths and schools, including Confucianism, including Stoicism, and so forth. But it was also subjected to this like attack about, well, isn't this a kind of direct contradiction of Christian universalism, of the idea that you are supposed to constantly be reaching out to the other as a Christian? So we just wanted to touch on this briefly because it does seem like the new ascendant right wing is newly vigorously Christian. And it also seems like there are a lot of we're going to continue to see a lot of these kinds of attacks against them. So have at it, guys. What do you make of it?
Yeah, like you said, I mean, this is basic Christian teaching going back to Augustine. I got a quote here from the Book of God. And the order of concord is first, that a man should harm no one, and second, that he should do good to all so far as he can. In the first place, therefore, he must care for his own household, for the order of nature and of human society itself gives him readier access to them and greater opportunity of caring for them. Hence the apostle says, but if any provide not for his own, and specifically for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. In this care lies the foundation of domestic peace. So he's just describing how human beings actually live, looking at, just the order of creation, the kind of human beings who God made us. Of course, we are to care for, the people around us more than some random person in Africa. I mean, that just kind of follows naturally just by our geographic disposition. I mean, we care for our neighbor, we care for our family. So this isn't new. Like you said, this is certainly in Catholic theology. I mean, this is in Protestantism too. This is in basically all Christian denominations. So absolutely nothing new. And it's just crazy and insane to me that, J.D. Vance here, no theologian, I mean, is actually just spouting just normal teaching. And actual theologians, Big Eva is a name kind of given to, kind of Protestant big time regime type of evangelicals. A lot of those guys are going crazy. And it's like, look, this is sad that the vice president of the United States is smoking you on theology. And that just tells us kind of why we're in the mess we're in today.
What seems to me really weird about this, now I'm not a Christian. I've studied it and, read about it and so forth. But I mean, I think Chesterton, now I could be completely off. He said something like Christianity without the church is just like being a psychopath. This sense that the Christian impulse, or what people call the Christian impulse of like, love everybody and give away all your stuff and don't be a person in the world, that somehow should be translated to like society and everybody has to act like this. That doesn't ring true for anything. For another thing, it's like we're not a Christian, we're not a theocracy. So why should we have to organize society on the basis of any particular religion or its precepts or its like moral impetus? And finally, as our friend Aaron Wren pointed out to me once, the Bible says love your neighbor as yourself, not more than yourself or not instead of yourself. It's love your neighbor as yourself. And that's a very tricky discipline because that means you have to love yourself first. And, presumably, and, you just look at like Dickens, where you've got like that in Bleak House, what was her name? Mrs. Jellyby, the woman who like practices this kind of telescopic philanthropy. All she does is worry about like slaves or people working on, plantations in the Americas or wherever. And her own children are like, hungry and like not being educated properly and falling down the stairs. I mean, this is it's just like this satire of like mistaken liberal priorities. But I think this doesn't even seem like a hard argument to be fighting. I mean, these are the same people. Okay, you think we should have our foreign policy and our immigration policy should all be based on Christianity? Okay, well, how about our abortion policy, our blue laws policy, and prayer in schools policy? should we permit minarets to be erected? I mean, whatever. It's just like it's total nonsense. I don't even understand why this is an argument that people feel obliged to respond to. It's just not made in good faith.
Only because it's right. Well, it's not made in good faith, and but it's also strikes very close to home. I mean, people know that it really that it makes people like JD Vance very antsy, or it makes people like the supporters of JD Vance very antsy to feel like they might somehow be doing Christianity wrong. It's like a very serious accusation, and it costs nothing to make, but everything to the person who's being accused, and it's very, very easy to get drawn into that sort of dispute, I think. But you're absolutely right. Like, two things are true. One, Christianity, as I understand it, sort of affirms all the basic obvious realities and then also layers on top of it this sort of cosmic, countercultural, and ultimately counterintuitive idea that we are also children of God. And this is like part of render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. That, like, as you're saying, Seth, and I guess as Chesterton was saying, like, if you take the injunctions of the church and you translate them into like public policy, you end up with a case for suicide. Like, the whole point is
Yeah.
Jesus is not doing a thing that is going to successfully lead him to the management of a nation. His kingdom is not
Right.
of this world, yada yada, all those verses. So that does create a situation where Christians have to kind of hold two truths in their mind at once, especially when you have to participate in government, as we do in a republic. But the people who are like using this as a cudgel against JD Vance are totally acting in bad faith. I just like Seth, vis-a-vis that Dickens passage. I was just reading Nancy Mitford's The Pursuit of Love, which is a wonderful little romance novel, but it has this character in it, Christian, who's a Marxist. And she writes, Christian always assumed that people were all right unless they told him to the contrary, when, except in the case of destitute, colored, oppressed, leprous, or otherwise unattractive strangers, he would take absolutely no notice. He was really only interested in mass wretchedness and never much cared for individual cases, however genuine their misery, while the idea that it is possible to have 3 square meals a day and a roof and yet be unhappy or unwell seemed to him intolerable nonsense. I mean, she's talking about exactly what you're...
Yeah, it's like outsourcing your personal charity to the state. Like, I'm going to outsource my sense of love and compassion to the state, and they should take care of it. That's not my job.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, this is...
yeah. I was going to say, Seth, you said a lot of these arguments are in bad faith, and in that interview that surfaced this great a reference to Catholic doctrine from J.D. Vance, he called out the Catholic bishops for
Right.
weighing in against sane immigration policy. So I did my own quick Doge-like look because Steve Malanga had a good piece, or Raphael Malanga had a good piece in City Journal. I think it was Raphael.
No, it was Steve Malanga.
Steve Malanga. Sorry, thanks, Seth. On Catholic Charities getting money for refugee resettlement, and this is a story that's familiar to a lot of our listeners. So I went and looked up the 990 from Catholic Charities Fort Worth in my backyard. In 2020, their outlays were 30-ish million. Their CEO, you had to do a little bit of math because he was fired in June. Their CEO made about $560,000 a year. In 2022, their outlays jumped to $135 million, or their revenue jumped to $135 million, and their CEO is making $900,000 a year. So there's a lot of this is venality masquerading as charity amongst a lot of individual actors and organizations which have benefited from the kind of charity industrial complex funded by the feds. So there's also that too.
It's also like, okay, I'm not going to spoil the ending of the movie Conclave. So listeners, if you've not yet seen it and you want to, cover your ears. But I watched the movie Conclave this weekend, which is about a bunch of bishops getting together, or cardinals getting together to elect a new pope. And it's famously kind of a woke take on the Catholic Church. So I was ready for that going in. What I was not prepared for is that the big gotcha scandal at the end is that they elect the new pope, and it turns out, gasp, he's intersex. He has a uterus. I'm not making this up. So this is a guy with a uterus who developed weirdly. And besides the fact that, like, incredible sanctimony of the virtue signal at the end of the movie, my first thought was like, oh my gosh, I'm I'm sure there are like 10 encyclicals about how to deal with intersex people. Like, they're treating it like this is some big paradox, conflict, scandal. But I'm like, there's no universe in which the Catholic Church has not already. And sure enough, I Googled it one time. It was like, yeah, they treat intersex people everybody's intrinsically male or female, and there's no barrier to people who are intrinsically male but intersex serving in the clergy. So it's like the people that undertook to make this movie about the Catholic Church didn't even bother to sort of like Google what Catholics actually believe. And that's what I also feel about these debates over like, oh, you think that like people should love their family first. It's like there's literally hundreds and hundreds of years of people discussing the issues that we've just briefly touched upon in this segment. Like the minute Jesus said, render unto Caesar, there then ensued just like nonstop chatter over what exactly we should do about that vis-a-vis the state. And it goes on uninterrupted until this time. So like, what is this thing where suddenly this is supposed to be some grand revelation? I find it all like we've been over this. This is not hard.
I read that book, Conclave. Like, I mean, I like the book. It's not quite as silly, I think, as the movie maybe made it. I haven't seen the movie.
The movie is beautiful and has some actually amazing performances in it, and all of like visually, it's very beautiful. I totally get why the novel would be good, because it struck me as something that was just like attempting to distill into a few key scenes. Like anyway, I could go on and on about the movie and why it's insane, but that we'll say that for an outtake because we are out of time and we have to wrap this up. Thanks for another great one, guys, and thanks to all of you for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to know more about the work that we do, you can visit our websites at ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com, AmericanMind.org, and our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. If you want to donate to support our work, we would appreciate it mightily, and you can do that at claremont.org/donate. And as always, don't forget to rate, review, share, subscribe. All that stuff really helps, especially if you're a fan of the show. Leave us a 5-star rating. And if you're not a fan of the show, at the very least, the least you could do is keep it to yourself. Thanks to our production and engineering crew, the brothers G, Jake, and Ryan Gannon. And thanks to you all for listening. We will talk to you next week.